following is an AZPM original production.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of the Press Room from the radio studios of AZPM. I'm your host, Steve Goldstein. We'll be discussing a lot of things on today's program, including Governor Hobbs going to the border, and some people are upset that she may be, in fact, working with the Trump administration on certain things. Our distinguished panelists today are Paul Ingram of the Tucson Sentinel, Ziegler of AZPM, Sarah Lapidus of Report for America and the Arizona Republic, and Christopher Conover of AZPM. Thank you all for being here today. We appreciate it. Zach, I want to start off with Sheriff Nanos holding on to this very, very tight lead. In essence, he is the winner, but we're going to see a recount. There are a lot of elements I want to touch on, and if you're comfortable with this, I want to ask you, it seemed as though the very, very late voters, day of, in fact, were impacted by some of the controversy around Sheriff Nanos and some of the suspensions, including one of his opponents, Heather Lappin. Can you give us some background on how some of those numbers went?
Yeah, I mean, you actually saw some of exactly what you were saying, where the votes for Nanos, 89% of them were early ballots, whereas for Heather Lappin, his challenger, about 82% of her votes were those early ones. So he definitely had an edge of those people, and it probably came from a lot of that media coverage that came in those final weeks leading up to the election that was not favorable for Chris Nanos.
Yeah, Sarah, there was so much controversy building at the end, and it does seem like the momentum could have ended up Heather Lappin's way. What are your thoughts about this recall situation, how it ended up going near the end? Just any thoughts about this race?
Yeah, I mean, Nanos kept a tight lead ahead of Lappin, but it was very small for most of it. And then, so I think people were pretty, half and half about who they wanted to see.
Yeah. Paul, what are your thoughts ultimately about how it ended up? Because it really does seem, we don't know yet. I suppose there were not detailed exit interviews, but it certainly seems like the assumption is that the more the headlines came out, the situation with the AZ Luminaria in particular was really working against Nanos.
Yeah, and one thing, you see is there's a lot of undervotes. There were lots of people who couldn't decide. They just decided not to fill in the bubble for that. So, I think people were increasingly frustrated with Nanos. People started going, okay, maybe I will vote for Lappin. I mean, one of the things we see is, most Democrats did really, really well in this election. So Nanos probably got carried by that a little bit just by being a D. And then, Heather being a Republican, that may have kind of won against her a little bit. But yeah, for that day, voters really went for Heather Lappin. And so now we go to a recount and we see how that goes.
Yeah. Buzz?
And we have to also look at when that story broke that Nanos had suspended Lappin and Aaron Cross, who's a sergeant who was campaigning against him. It broke right after early ballots had gone out. Mm-hmm. So, and we know that a lot of people vote those early ballots that first weekend, and then there's a drop-off. If it had happened beforehand, and we're only about 500 votes separate, amazing, it may have made a difference. I think it helped to tighten this race, but the timing of it may have played against Lappin.
Zach, do you know the process of the recount? We've heard it might take a couple of weeks.
As far as the recounts go, I'm not sure the exact details, but I know they go back through. A lot of times there is a small amount of a change, but it may not be the 495 votes that would switch the race. The largest recount switch that I could find looking it up was for Al Franken when he ran for Senate in Minnesota back in 2008. That one swapped 440 votes, but that was statewide.
Okay, Chris?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's exactly right, because this is a machine recount, so they're just going to run all the ballots again. Those machines don't make a lot of errors. Do errors happen? Sure, but they don't make a whole lot of errors. This one will take more time because they have to recount all the ballots, and it's a 2-page ballot, so it just takes time at this point.
Sarah, there was discussion that there might be, in fact, some major personnel turnover if, in fact, Nanos holds his seat. What have you heard about that, just because of the backlash and a couple lawsuits and whatnot? Do you think that could really affect the department going forward?
I think so. And even Supervisor Hines mentioned a morale issue. And deputies have talked about the lack of morale. They don't trust who's leading them. And so I think that could have an impact.
Yeah, Paul, is there there's always a shortfall when it comes to employees, when it comes to law enforcement around the country. Is that something that could make it even worse in Pima County? Because if Nanos is as unpopular as he seems, we may see a lot of resignations potentially.
Yeah, I mean, there was a press conference with Aaron Cross and also with Dr. Richard Carmona, who really talked about there was a huge morale issue, and there were lots of deputies, retired deputies, who said, hey, inside the department, there's people who want to leave if Nanos continues to be in charge. And we'll see how that happens. I mean, sometimes people say, I would like to leave, but they don't really do it because really it comes down to it. This is their mortgage. This is their paycheck. This is how they pay for their food for their kids. So when it comes down to it, they may keep on it. But it could mean that the sheriff's department kind of slowly loses officers over time to attrition, officers retire, deputies retire before they would have earlier, or they try to move to other departments. I mean, there are other departments, and some of the departments are really competitive compared to the sheriff's department, especially departments in Phoenix. That's actually also TPD's problem. Is they tend to lose officers to these other departments. So
I think people who are watching and listening to this program are up to date on this. We've talked about it week after week as well, but briefly, kind of Cliff's Notes version, par for the course in terms of Nanos turning a lot of people off one way or the other just because of his management style?
I think Nanos has a tough management style. He's been in the department for a long time. And one thing to keep in mind is he's been around. He was around Darnell through Dupnick's terms. He's been in the department, and he's been kind of in a command position for a while. But it just seems like for some various reasons, different deputies really just don't like his management style. They've accused him of bullying. They've said that he's gone after people for criticisms, giving them different jobs that are harder. So we'll have to see how this winds up. It just takes time about whether people really want to leave the department or not. But yeah, I suspect that he's going to have some problems. And he's been able to get some of his officers, get deputies from where they were really down. But that's going to require training. So if the agency has a bad reputation, it may be harder in the future for them to get new officers in.
Chris, I'm not asking for a prediction, but unlikely Heather Lappin and Aaron Cross are part of this department if Chris Nanos wins?
It's interesting. Hannah Cree, who's done a lot of reporting for us on this, talked to Heather Lappin right after the election and said, are you in or out? And Lappin didn't want to commit to either. You could see why, logically, she might say, I'm going to go find something else to do. She is a lieutenant. Aaron Cross also, you could see why he might want to be finished with this department. But as far as I know, neither of them has publicly said what they're going to do at this point.
I'll stay with you on this. AZPM.org is reporting, this is a controversy that Sheriff Nanos running into a fight with the supervisors. A new development with the Pima County Sheriff Sergeant who had been involved in a sexual assault case. What's the latest? What are you guys reporting on that?
The latest is that trial is coming up. The defense is trying to get some things thrown out, calling into question the DNA testing. It was a sexual assault at a deputy's Christmas party in December of 2022 at a private home of one of the deputies. As far as I know, and Paul, I know you've covered this too, nobody's denying that the deputies had sex. The question is consent and alcohol and other things involved. So trying to get some things thrown out, this is going to trial either way. The deputy who was accused was fired by the department and arrested and has been behind bars, as far as I know, for quite a while awaiting trial. So the trial is finally coming up. But there was a lot of criticism of Nanos of the way it was handled internally. And that's one of the times more recently that he got sideways with the Pima County Board of Supervisors.
So, Paul, how significant is this latest step as far as this entire case goes?
I mean, this is always, of course, part of the, people are laying out their defense. They're laying out their defense for trial. They're trying to, knock down some of the evidence so that they can maybe be more easier to convince a jury, hey, this is something that happened, but not all the evidence that's laid out is there. And we'll see this over time. I mean, you see this with lots of cases. This is just the way that this happens in all kinds of cases. The defense wants to break down some of the evidence, poke holes in the case.
Sarah, let's jump to another election-related story. And this happened with the Pima County Recorder's Office decided to shut down an early online voting portal there were some concerns, and now the supervisors have questioned the Pima County Recorder about, did anyone actually miss out on a ballot situation? What are you watching with this particular situation? Because it was frustrating. It was nerve-wracking for a lot of people. Am I actually going to get my early ballot? Am I going to have to go in person?
Yeah, so there was an issue with they were changing something in the last minute, and the recorder's office and the elections department were told at the last minute of this change. So there was delay in printing the ballots, and that freaked a lot of people out. So there was an influx in, oh my God, am I going to get my ballot? And so they had to shut the portal down because there's a mandate, a statute that says they have to, fulfill that request within 48 hours.
Right.
And they had other ways of getting to voters. The voters could call, they could email. So they're sure they didn't disenfranchise any voters. They checked with the Secretary of State's office, the county attorney. So.
But Zach, there was also a concern that maybe people, if they didn't get the message from the recorder's office, oh my gosh, what do I do?
Yeah, and they actually said a big issue was people were double registering, putting in requests again, which just adds to the backlog, adds to the issues. And so it was like, okay, that's what's coming in right now. Let's just shut things down, I believe was Recorder Cussers Kelly's explanation of things to the Board of Supervisors when she was called before them.
Yeah. Chris, I'm curious, and I know that there has been some back and forth, especially with Sheriff Nanos, has not just been a 4-1 Democrats versus Republicans, but is there a potential here that this could look political? Maybe the supervisors are protecting the recorder because, again, not knowing all the details, people were pretty concerned because even those who are not necessarily quote unquote election deniers are still thinking, wait a second, is my ballot actually going to count? Does the recorder's office have a lot of questions to answer here still?
The recorder's office definitely has some questions to answer. I think what could help the recorder's office is there was not a big public outcry of, I never got my ballot. I'm on the permanent early voting list and I never got my ballot. There was not a lot of outcry for that. Anybody who didn't get a ballot still had a way to get a ballot. It was just this one portal that was shut down. Granted, a very convenient portal online taken care of. That's, if I hadn't gotten mine, that's where I would have gone, was do it online. But there, you could have walked in, you could have called, and the ballots were delayed a couple of days going out. I know mine came in a little bit later than it normally does. Mm-hmm. But again, because there was no great public outcry of people yelling, I was disenfranchised, I think the recorder, if she and the elections director can have the fix in place for the next election, they'll get by okay.
Yeah. But sir, we know Supervisor Christie did want there to be an investigation. There's just not going to be.
Exactly. He said that he wanted an investigation to see if anything criminal happened, and he kind of put it on the supervisors that they might have been protecting politically if they didn't say yes to this request for investigation.
Yeah. Zach, any final thoughts on that one?
No,
Okay.
time we'll see. We'll see
Okay.
where things go.
And Paul, any thoughts on that?
I mean, one thing is you see that, there's been all these talks about elections, that people aren't getting the chance to vote. That keeps amping everybody up. And we see this with this portal. I mean, they just needed to wait a day or two for their ballots to show up in a lot of cases. And since they hadn't showed up, they kind of panicked and they asked for an early vote. But you also could have just walked in to vote. There were lots of early voting locations that were running even the weekend before the election. You could have walked in and just voted. And then the day of, you can always still vote. Thousands of people voted. So I think, and asking for a criminal investigation is the wrong way to do it. I mean, instead, just an investigation. Did everyone who asked to vote, did they get to vote? Yes, then we're good. People who wanted to vote, vote. And there's certainly people who asked for a ballot who just never get around to it. And then that's not the recorder or the recorder's fault or the elections department's fault. Some people just decide not to vote.
Yeah. And Chris, I think the criminal question's a really good one that Paul brings up. Because you're inconvenienced, let's say you want to get the ballot in the mail, or you may or may not, and as you just said, maybe a couple days late, there still is that option. It's not as though you can't vote now. So the criminal aspect does seem a little bit going
The
far.
criminal aspect probably was a bit of a stretch because, as Paul said, there are other ways to vote. At the very worst, if they said, they being the county said, we mailed you a ballot, and you say, well, I never got it, and you show up on election day and they say, we sent you a ballot, and you say, well, I never got it. They let you vote a provisional ballot, and then after the election, they go back and try and figure out what happened because maybe it got lost in the mail. These things do happen. And okay, yes, you're right. you never voted that ballot we sent you. We only have you voting one time. Great, we count, and off we go.
But as we know, there's an increased level of paranoia now. Even if it's done innocently, mistakes are almost not forgiven anymore, it seems.
Right.
Plus, there's the fun of this being a battleground state, and the sooner you fill out that ballot and get it in the mail, the calls, the mailers, the texts start going down.
The mailers actually go down? Oh my gosh, I don't think my postal person knew that. Paul, let's head to the border.
Sure.
Figuratively.
Okay.
Governor Hobbs was there and is getting criticism from both sides, it seems. They tell us that's good. I'm not always sure that is good, but so what did she have to say about what she's talking about at the border and whether she's willing to actually, let's say, cooperate with the Trump administration on certain levels?
I mean, one of the things she said is she's really going out and kind of giving us a status report on things that she did back in June, which was really to send National Guard troops to the border to work at the port of Mariposa and help the agency, CBP, do some of the inspections. And that's really what they're there for. So they do traffic. They kind of make sure people drive through the non-intrusive inspection machines, which is basically just a fancy x-ray, and, check cars for whether or not there's maybe something in it that shouldn't be there. They also help run train operations, which means basically they make sure they open the gates and make sure the train can drive through and next to the DeConcini port. So all those things are being done, have been done for a while, and she was really giving kind of a status report. But of course, the other odd thing is she has to talk about what she's going to do with an incoming Trump administration. And she's, I think, kind of trying to straddle the fence. She's saying, look, I want to do counter-narcotics stuff. I want to make sure that the border is secure. I'm willing to work with the Trump administration or not. But she also said if the Trump administration comes and does things that hurt people, or as she put it, misguided policies, if they engage in that, I'm going to do something about it. But she didn't want to say what she was going to do. She doesn't want to kind of lay out her cards. So I think in part, right now, everyone's trying to decide what the Trump administration is going to do. The Trump administration, future Trump administration, has made a lot of claims about what they were going to do. But the question is, what are they legally going to be able to do? What are they logistically going to be able to do? What are they financially going to be able to do? And that's all up in the air. So I think that right now, the smart governors are the ones saying, let's see what they do.
Well, and Chris, what kind of pressure does that put on a Democrat in a border state? Obviously, Governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, doesn't have the same kind of pressure Katie Hobbs does.
Well, and Katie Hobbs, we have to remember, will be in the midterms running for re-election, should she choose to do that, in a state that 4 years ago went for Biden, barely, this time went for Trump, but elected Ruben Gallego as a Democrat. So she really has a political fence that she's got to walk down and trying to keep both sides happy. With the number of registered independents or registered no party in Arizona, you've got to play to the middle. You have to, if you play hard to one side running statewide, you could have a big problem. So she's got to find a middle ground on all of this.
Well, and I'm making my own leap here. It reminds me a little bit of Prop 314 in the sense that the controversial provision is the one of, in essence, giving local law enforcement a chance to get involved in the immigration situation, which a lot of people are concerned about. But it also had the other provisions related to fentanyl and it related to E-Verify. So I wonder if the governor's trying to do, Paul, a little bit like, yes, I am not interested in helping the Trump administration if they're going to deport people, but if we can stop drugs from coming in, maybe I will help them.
Yeah, I think that's really what she was saying, is that, doing things on the border to stop fentanyl, doing things to keep guns from going into Mexico, doing things to keep cash from going into Mexico. Those are all things that are really important. And, lots and lots of people have come to the border to talk about this. Back in the late winter, Ruben Gallego, Chris Mays, they all came out to Nogales and kind of said, hey, we need to have money for non-intrusive inspections. This is a very popular technology. It's a way of protecting the border, the ports, and really making sure that drugs, and most drugs come through the ports. So putting up machines that can look for those and seek them out and send it to CBP officers so they can tear apart the car and go find them is going to be really important. And yeah, Hobbs is in that position where she really has to show that she's trying to do that work.
And that is something you see at when you get these press conferences at the border. You can kind of tell where people stand because this time Hobbs at a port of entry, when Vice President Harris was here campaigning at a port of entry, when you see incoming President Trump there, he is at the wall. That's what you see. J.D. Vance, when he would be there. they'd be sitting in front of the wall. It's almost kind of that difference in messaging of what they want to do about this.
Yeah, and Sarah, not to put you in the spotlight here, but I'm really curious as to thoughts about that when you're trying to figure out ways to make practical differences, and yet knowing all these things become political. How much do you expect there to be activity on the border just because there's so much noise about it? Do you think Governor Hobbs is going to have to do something on the border, regardless of whether it is?
I think so. And I mean, during this election, we even saw Kamala Harris come to the border, and she has almost never come to the border before, or very few. So I think that Hobbs will have to do more at the border.
Yeah. So, Chris, another AZPM story, not exclusively, but Danielle talked to the new Tucson Border Patrol chief as the former sector head is going to D.C. Any good answers about how he intends to do his job?
When Danielle sat down and talked with him a couple of days ago, we aired that piece this morning. It's up on our website. He'd been on the job about a week and a half.
So he's got all the problems solved.
Everything is solved, completely solved. He's got it figured out. Not a big deal. He did not have a lot of solid answers. Granted, he'd been on the job a week and a half. However, he did come out of Yuma, so he is not unfamiliar with the border, and he pointed back some to Yuma, but solid going forward plans. She asked him about what it's going to be like with the new administration coming in. Not a surprise. He really did not want to answer that question, understandably. He's a career government person. Getting on the incoming president's radar may not be the best idea, as there are different ideas put down. So no, there weren't a lot of what I would call solid, this is what we're going to do. He said he's still in a kind of a fact-finding mode, getting his feet under him here in Tucson as the chief. He was here as an agent many, many years ago.
Paul, anything we should know about the person he's succeeding who's heading to D.C.? Was there anything interesting dynamically, politically there or anything?
I mean, one thing is a lot of the guys who end up becoming the chief of a sector, they're career guys. They've been around for a long time. They often have, especially the Tucson sector. The Tucson sector is the one of the biggest sectors in the nation. It has the most agents. It has 9 stations. It's a big, unwieldy sector, and it's also one of the busiest. Historically, it's been the busiest, and even back in December, it was the busiest in the entire nation. So you really have to have a sense of how to manage these things. And so there's lots of moving parts, lots of constituents that you have to deal with, not just make sure agents are out there in the field. There's more other things you have to do. And so, I mean, the new coming guy, he's got some experience to do this. But then we see with Maudlin, who's the former chief, he's going to D.C. He's going to be the chief of operations. So again, somebody who's a manager is going to D.C. to run this kind of thing. And we see this, the Tucson sector has often been kind of a place for people who are serious managers of the agency go to work. Mm-hmm. These are always people who have pretty long careers, and have been sometimes often the chiefs of other sectors who have already worked in other places. I mean, our incoming chief has been the chief of 2 different sectors. He was Yuma, but he was also
one in Texas.
Montana.
Montana.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
But he did work in Texas. Yeah.
He's worked in Texas. Yeah. And you see that's pretty consistently. You see guys work in California, Texas. They kind of bounce around for a while. Yeah. They always end up working in the northern sector for a little bit before they come out to the west again. And really, this is kind of a hard charging sector. This is the sector where people want to work.
So you're saying when someone comes to the management experience level, are they able to avoid then some of the political controversies? Like they're actually brought in to do a job, they're given orders to follow, and they're not actually affecting policy?
No, I mean, they're not really affecting policy. Their job is to make sure that it happens, depending on what the administrations do. And there's also legal constraints that they have to deal with. There's management constraints, and there's just financial constraints. I mean, you only have X number of agents. You can only do X number of things. I mean, that was one of the things that Maudlin ran into when there were thousands of people waiting outside of Lukeville. That became a huge management problem for them, which is in part why they started shuttering some of the checkpoints. They just had to move agents to other locations. Now those agents are mostly back in the field. We see apprehensions have really dropped significantly, even since December, and they pretty much can stay consistently. So they kind of shifted how they do things. We're going more towards going to the deep desert, trying to find people who are actually trying to move through, the really, really remote reaches of the estate. So doing more of that kind of work too. But do they try to avoid these kinds of political questions? I know we ask them these political questions, and they really try to not answer these questions, because for them, the White House and also the officials at DHS, they're the ones who guide policy. These guys' job is to implement that policy.
Yeah, so we'll watch what comes next. Now,
one of the things that the new chief was talking about was the phrase, and Paul will know it, is gotaways, the number of people who crossed that they didn't catch. And he pointed out that gotaways, as they refer to them, are down, and he wants to continue that trend. Now, again, he didn't tell us how, and some of that may be operational, but it's a management thing, exactly as Paul said. If you have to move agents like they did from when Lukeville was so backed up, you have to move agents over to there. That leaves holes in other areas, and it becomes a big management game, because Border Patrol, like other law enforcement we were talking about, they always need more agents.
We're down to our last minute or so. Sarah, I just want to bring you, because when we have panels of reporters like this who are talented and are covering these things, in a few seconds, do you expect to get more assignments to go on the border in 2025? I mean, I know we don't know from week to week, but is that something you expect to be a priority?
Definitely. It's all hands on deck for border issues and stories.
Yeah. Chris, do you expect to be assigning people to?
Absolutely.
Paul?
Oh, I definitely know where
You've been doing it for a long time.
I've been covering the border for almost 14 years, so I feel like I know every part of it. At this point, I watch a documentary about the border and I go, I've been there.
Zach, you're producer reporter, so you've got to do it all.
I do a fair amount. Luckily, we've got Danielle for that, and she just does a knockdown, drag-out job.
Terrific. Thanks, everybody. Zach Ziegler of AZPM, Paul Ingram of the Tucson Sentinel, Sarah Lapidus, Report for America and the Arizona Republic, Christopher Conover of AZPM. Thank you all for being here today. And thank all of you for watching and listening to this latest edition of The Press Room. Back with another episode next week. I'm Steve Goldstein.